Welcome back to the IEA's podcast, Everything Energy. I'm Dan Hewitt. This week, how can Southeast Asia power its rising energy demand? It's a region that's growing fast. So fast that since 2015, Southeast Asian GDP rose 30%. And rising living standards and urbanization need the same thing: energy and plenty of it. The region is set to account for a quarter of the growth in energy demand over the next decade. But what are the investments and policies that will allow the region to meet these demands securely? To explore what that might look like, I'm joined by Sue-Ern Tan. She's the head of the IEA's new Regional Cooperation Centre in Singapore, which opened last year. Sue-Ern, thank you so much for joining us today. So I think to start, let's just ask why we're focusing an energy podcast on these 10 countries in Southeast Asia. So we know the region is growing, we know it's using more energy, but maybe you could put the pace of change into context for us.
Yeah, so firstly, just to put more context into it, the 10 countries that we're looking at for what we call the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or the Southeast Asia region, are in alphabetical order: Brunei Darussalam, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos People's Democratic Republic, Malaysia, Myanmar, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam, and very shortly Timor-Leste will become a member later this month in October. So if we look first in terms of energy demand, what we see in Southeast Asia is of the next 10 years of the global energy demand growth, 25% of that growth will come from Southeast Asia region. This is second only to India. So it's a very important driver in terms of global energy trends. Now, there's a set of dynamic forces behind what's driving that growth. The first one is from a demographic perspective. Southeast Asia is adding the equivalent of a new Singapore to its urban population every year from now to 2050. So you've got this increasing urbanization happening in the region. The second one, particularly important for this region, although it's also a global trend, is the need for cooling. Air conditioning is a very important issue, both for households, but also for buildings generally. And we see about a 5 times rise in air conditioning ownership by 2035. The third one is around transport. So this region is already like one of the leading markets in terms of two-wheelers. You see a lot of motorbikes riding around this region in many of these countries. But we're also starting to see increasing ownership of cars as we start to see increasing wealth of the population. So that's another key factor in terms of the energy demand. And then finally, and quite an important one, is there is also this industrial manufacturing story that sits behind the drivers for this energy demand growth. It has a key role to play in terms of some of the global value chains. It's really stepping up in the critical mineral space, in the clean energy technology space. So I think that's a particularly important thing. And then maybe if I can just deep dive into just the power sector, and so the electricity demand component for this region, what we start to see is that by 2035, electricity demand itself is expected to get up to 22,000 terawatt hours. So that's effectively the equivalent of 2 Japan's worth of energy annual consumption. So that is a significant amount of new electricity supply that will need to be delivered into the market.
Okay, let's unpack a few of the things you mentioned there, starting with technologies associated with electrification: batteries, solar PV, the refining of critical minerals. How pivotal is the region right now for the development of clean energy technologies?
Yeah, I think that this is actually one of the real opportunity stories for Southeast Asia. So if we just zoom out a little bit to start off with, the IEA has been talking a lot and trying to highlight one of the significant energy security risks that we see are happening globally, and that's around that heavy concentration for critical minerals, refining and processing. And so that need for diversification, which is one of the IEA's golden rules of energy securities, is really an opportunity here for the Southeast Asia region. So if we exclude China for a moment and we look at the rest of Asia, It actually has a very strong position for critical minerals. So it has about 55% of the global nickel reserve, about 12% of the rare earths, which is a very important element, 9% of cobalt, and 8% of graphite. So there is a real opportunity here from a production point of view for the critical minerals itself. You then add to that the potential for the supply chain, so then using the critical minerals into the energy technology side. And again, there is an opportunity for Southeast Asia to do more in that global supply chain and to, potentially be a powerhouse, in fact, of the energy technologies. So, for example, Indonesia and the Philippines together already produce more than 60% of the world's nickel. So that's essential for things like, lithium-ion batteries. Then we've also got some very important work that's happening around battery production, solar PV manufacturing. So if I give you, for example, just Indonesia as one country. So as I said, Indonesia is already the top producer in both mining and refining of nickel. It in fact attracted over $50 billion US for nickel-related investment between 2014 and 2023. And it really has this very strong political ambition to be a real battery manufacturing hub. So it's got an ambition to produce about 140 gigawatts of battery manufacturing by 2030.
Let's talk about the region's energy mix today, right now. So how does the region power itself? And maybe you could tell us a bit about the mix between fossil fuels and clean energy.
So in 2024, about half of Southeast Asia's electricity came from coal, about a quarter from natural gas, and another quarter from renewables. And that dominance of fossil fuel has been the case since 2010. So since 2010, about 80% of the rise in Southeast Asia's energy demand has been met mainly by fossil fuels and mainly coal. But Southeast Asia is a very diverse region. So across the 10 countries, there are, variations. So definitely we see coal dominating in countries like Indonesia, the Philippines, and Vietnam. Gas is a very central role for places like Thailand, Singapore, and Brunei Darussalam. But then we've got hydropower playing a very key role in places like Laos, and also contributions in places like Cambodia and Vietnam. So there is also variation among the 10 countries. The one thing that I've noticed, particularly since being able to go around to visit the region since the center was set up at the start of this year, is there is a lot of appetite for looking to diversify the energy supply from the governments in this region. And one of the areas that they are looking at is the role for renewables, particularly. Vietnam is a good example of this with their most recent power development plan aid that they've released. Similarly, Indonesia and also the Philippines to look for ways to diversify the supply and what can they do with their domestic sources of renewable power.
Okay, you mentioned renewable energy there. Let's talk about the scale of untapped renewable energy supply. So I've got a stat that there's an estimated 20 terawatts of untapped solar and wind potential across the region. Could you put that in context?
Yeah, that actually was part of a report that the IEA released late last month on integrating solar and wind into the Southeast Asia region. And that's exactly right. So it's 20 terawatts of untapped solar and wind potential. That's roughly 55 times the region's current total generation capacity. So, there is a bit of a capacity here for Southeast Asia to really harness even a fraction of that potential could really make a difference in terms of adding to the diversity of the energy supply sources and from an energy security point of view.
And if some of that energy can be tapped, maybe you could give us a sense of what that would mean for energy security in the region.
Yeah, so maybe two things. So one, at the moment, it's still very dependent on a fossil fuel imports for the region. And we estimate that, from a cost point of view is about $200 billion a year. So that's a large amount in terms of an import bill to have to be met annually from a fossil fuel perspective. So I think that's one point to think about. I think the second thing is, there is a potential for this region to really maximize the fact that costs for solar and particularly solar, but also wind, onshore wind, has really come down significantly over the past few years. and it's really now a very competitive source of new electricity globally. So I think that there is a real potential for the region to tap into that cost reduction. And then I think the final point I'd like to make is, and also this was highlighted in the report that we released that I mentioned about integrating solar and wind, is because the amount of penetration of renewables is still quite low in Southeast Asia, the ability to integrate it into existing power systems without too much, large capex investments. So just thinking about how do you run your power system more flexibly, things like moving your dispatch time closer to real time. These are measures that can be put in place already without significant, financial burden.
Okay, you mentioned financing there. So maybe we could just look into some of the potential roadblocks. Southeast Asia accounts for 5% of global energy demand, but accounts for just 2% of clean energy spending. So what are some of the reasons for that gap? And maybe what are some of the solutions to potentially bring it down?
Yeah, I think that large difference is something that the IEA has been highlighting for some time now. And if I was to put a number on it, if the region was to achieve the climate goals, so 8 out of the 10 ASEAN countries have set net zero goals. In order to achieve that, the amount of the annual clean energy investment must increase nearly 6 times by 2035. So that's over the next 10 years. So that's a significant amount of money that's required. The real key challenge is around the high cost of capital for emerging markets and developed economies. So it's true for other EMDs across the world, but also for this region. So it's about twice as high here in Southeast Asia, the cost of capital, compared to developed economies. So how to break that barrier down and how to then mobilize much more capital for projects in Southeast Asia is a key area of focus.
And can I just jump in there? When you say the price of capital is twice as high, I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit more about what you mean there.
So it's twice as high in terms of investing. It costs you twice as more, and there's a combination of reasons around it. It's a mix of both perceived and actual risks. They sit around the political risks, the regulatory certainty risks, as well as often sometimes there is a currency issue. In other words, you borrow in USD, but you want to invest in the local currency. One other point here is, though, in terms of the investor perceptions of that risk, again, it varies across the countries in the region. So in Indonesia, for example, the top concerns for investors in terms of a risk appetite sits around the regulatory, political, and off-taker risk. So if we produce this amount of electricity, who's going to buy it? It needs to go somewhere, so we need someone who's willing to take that supply and then put it into the market. In Vietnam, political risk is the main barrier, followed by regulatory and transmission risks. So in other words, is there somewhere that will take the electrons and move it along? So what's the transmission and grid capacity like? So there is a bit of a mix across the two. But overall, we would see that the political and regulatory risks are the largest drivers of that higher capital cost in Southeast Asia. So part of the conversation that we're having with governments is, certainty and predictability, right? That's what investors are looking for. Energy projects are large scale, they're long-term investments, and what investors need to see and feel comfort in order to make that kind of investment is that sort of predictability, transparency in the regulatory and policy frameworks that they need to operate these projects in.
And in terms of companies wanting certainty, I wonder if that's reflected in the types of energy sources they are still investing in today. Because, for example, for every dollar invested in fossil fuels in the region, just 80 cents goes to clean energy. So I wonder if we can compare the two and the way that people are investing between renewable energy sources and fossil fuels.
Yeah, so as you say, that trend of the 80 cents going to clean energy for every dollar, it really does show a bit of a contrast if you look at the global numbers, where the ratio is for every dollar in fossil fuel, it's $2, about $2 that gets invested in clean energy grids and storage. I think in terms of the investment, we are starting to see that total and energy investment stepping up for the region. Of about the $70 billion in 2023 that was invested in energy, about $32 billion of that was in clean energy. So there is that appetite and interest in investing in clean energy projects. But there is also, I would say, just listening to the stakeholders that we've spoken to on the ground and the government side, I think as more governments put into place and clearer some of the ambitions around where they want to see the role of renewables, but also things like nuclear, by the way, which is also being discussed in the region, in their overall future energy and power development plans. I think that helps some of the private sector, but also the important role that multilateral banks will play in this region to kick in some of that investment that's required. One of the particular areas, though, that we're also paying some attention to is not just on the financing for the generation projects. We're also very interested in understanding the investment in the grids and transmission lines which is required. So that is a global trend in terms of that mismatch between an investment in generation and the investment in grid. So the investment in grid is falling behind the level of investment in generation. So for every dollar invested in power generation projects, only 40 cents get invested in grid. So that mismatch is a problem, and it's definitely an issue here in Southeast Asia. And it's part of the reason why some of the work that's being done, particularly around the ASEAN power grid, which is an initiative to find a way to move the electrons around the region and share those and have interconnections between countries, is such a critical project, because it does help to enable both the investment, but also really importantly from an energy security point of view, the ability to share and do cross-border power trade to try and provide some of that energy security for the region more broadly.
Okay, we mentioned at the top Southeast Asia's role in supply chains, but could you explain for us just how vital a cog the region is to the global energy system?
I think, particularly in the current context where geopolitical disruptions have really elevated, energy security to basically a matter of national security. And you're seeing that almost unprecedented link between energy and geopolitics really, very tangibly at the moment globally, and definitely it's also being felt here in the region. Then from a manufacturing perspective, we've got Southeast Asia really emerging as a major manufacturing hub. Countries like Vietnam, Thailand and Malaysia are growing these solar manufacturing hubs, with the region already accounting for around 10% of global solar PV cell and module supply. But, one of the other key roles from a region point of view is from a supply route point of view. And that concentration of manufacturing around the world means that trade is very important. And more than half of the global clean technology trade passes through the Straits of Malacca, which for listeners is an incredibly narrow waterway. So it does, again, from a just regional, even from a supply trade point of view, play a really critical role. So then from a policy point of view, some of the conversations that we're having with the governments in the region about, well, how do we maximize that opportunity for this region to really step up into that global supply chain? It is the same principles that we're telling a lot of the governments around the 3 golden rules for energy security. So the first one, which I've already discussed, is around diversification. That really important need to think about diversifying your energy sources, your supply routes, your supply chains. The second one, which is within the gift of government, is around predictability, which I've also mentioned, that important of thinking through avoiding, stop and go approaches to policy, things that change up and down, because those things do not attract investors and they increase costs. They're part of the risks when investors are thinking about cost of capital. And then the final one is really around cooperation. And this is where we do see opportunity here in Southeast Asia. So that opportunity for cooperation is one that we really see can be further leveraged. So if we look at, for example, the ASEAN power grid, where we've already had some good practical examples. So there is already an existing, for example, trade of power all the way from Laos. It flows through Thailand, then Malaysia and into Singapore. This is an excellent example of 4 countries working together, to shift the electrons around. The question now is, how do we build on that momentum and get more of that going through? And we are seeing some discussions about some other of the interconnections. And on this, we really want to congratulate the ASEAN member states, because they are really focusing on how can they move into the implementation phase of the ASEAN power grid.
Okay, so those are some of the policies that have worked in the past, that have had a proven impact. But let's just go back to the net zero emission goal. So 8 of the 10 countries in the region have them. So what options do governments have to help those countries meet those goals? What are some of the things that have worked in the past and that people should be looking at today?
These are very important aspirational goals that the governments have set, and achieving them will require decisive actions on power systems, on the investment frameworks, and that very important point around regional cooperation. One key priority is actually on expanding and modernizing the power grids domestically within the countries, as well as building out the stronger regional interconnections, i.e. connecting countries' power systems together. And that is, essential both in terms of that energy security perspective for the region, but it's also providing the flexibility to integrate more of that untapped potential of solar and wind in the region. And that's a really key plank for the energy security for this region. As I said, we had a report that was released at the end of September around integrating solar and wind in Southeast Asia, and we go through some very clear policy recommendations of how governments in this region can scale up renewable energy deployment, but also really importantly, learn from the lessons from other parts of the world on how to integrate that variability or that flexibility of those intermittent power sources. And at the foundation of it is really having that clear and consistent policy frameworks, trying to think through what are some of that multi-year policy certainty. So thinking a lot more about the energy planning and spending more effort there as a government to provide that longer term certainty for investors.
And lastly, we saw during the energy crisis of 2022-23 how fast energy prices rose in the region. But I wonder if you could give us a sense of maybe how things have changed in the last few years. And maybe we could talk about some of the ways that the region is perhaps more resilient than it was a few years ago.
So you're right. This region, was impacted by the world energy crisis in 2022 in terms of the price spikes. We do see the import bill for oil and gas remaining quite large for this region, exceeding around $200 billion USD. But I think the positive things that we have seen is the government is in this region really thinking through how do they diversify their energy security, both from a domestic point of view, but also really importantly from a cooperation point of view at an ASEAN level, but also bilaterally between the governments in this region. There's really this positive momentum to think through, okay, how do we implement now the physical infrastructure? How do we think about standardizing our codes, our grids, our operation technical standards, which can sound a bit boring, but are really that kind of fundamental skeleton that you need in place and the governance structures around that in order to really have a genuinely connected ASEAN power grid. But there's really positive political momentum towards that, and a lot of active engagement as well from industry, from finance, from multilateral organizations, including the Asia Development Bank, the World Bank, and of course from organizations like the ASEAN Center for Energy and the ASEAN Secretariat, and really importantly, the IEA, who continues to want to provide the analysis, the data, convene where we can, and bring together the relevant bodies in order to help the countries in these regions to meet their energy ambitions in a secure, affordable, and reliable way.
Well, Sue-Ern, thanks so much for your time. Thanks so much for coming in to talk to us today.
Thank you for the opportunity.